I imagine that I am not the only one at least minorly confused by Loki Season 2 thus far. I'm enjoying the show thus far, aside from the whiplash of Episode 2, as I swear there must have been a scene or two cut from that. The opening of Episode 2 is just so jarring and it really feels like the show is missing some context for that episode. Regardless of that though, what confuses me most about Season 2 of Loki thus far is the temporal loom. Specifically, how does the temporal loom work? And how is it currently interacting with the branching timelines? Season 2 was made a point to show us whether a character is on the sacred timeline or a branched timeline. And this is interesting as I just assumed that the branched timelines would be woven into the sacred timeline. However, even if they are being woven into the structure of the sacred timeline, they are still considered separate branches. And this makes me wonder not only what time was like prior to the TVA, but also how the loom works in relation to the sacred and branched timelines. If the TVA did not always exist, as it clearly has not, then how was time experienced? There are so many questions that are raised by this machine. How does it pull timelines into it? Based on details within the show, it also is clear that the branching timelines are variations of the 616 timeline, which then raises more questions. If this temporal loom only manages the 616 timeline and its variants, then are there more TVAs out there? Are there more He Who Remains and other black holes? Universes, mind you, that appear to be contained within black holes, as implied by the finale of Loki Season 1. In Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, we see the timeline known as 838, which is wholly separate from 616, and therefore, if we really wanted to destroy our brains, it could mean that there is another TVA out there managing the 838 timeline and its alternate timeline branches. Well, this isn't necessarily what's implied, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I almost wonder if there could be multiple He Who Remains across several universes that operate different TVAs that all in fact end up warring with each other, or starting the multiversal war in some way or another. I also still have so many questions about how the logic of being able to see the timelines works, and this of course connects to the TVA's physical location. From the Citadel at the end of time where He Who Remains resided, the sacred timeline was visible to the eye, and when it started branching, this was visible as well. If He Who Remains was at the Citadel located in the void at the end of time, then could the TVA be located in the void at the beginning of time? If the TVA oversees and manages the temporal loom and by extension the timelines, then wouldn't it make sense for the TVA's location to be at some sort of void at the beginning of time, where they can catch the alternate timelines that branch off from a loop of the timeline? When thinking about the Ouroboros connection this season, it would make sense that in some ways the TVA is both at the beginning and end of time, as the timeline that He Who Remains was operating was a continuous loop, and this means that likely the loom is at the start of the loop where it can catch the branching timelines coming from the other side of the loop. Though, there is still the question of how the machine even works. How does it pull in all of these branching timelines into something cohesive? How are things actually pruned? Was that detail from Season 1 about quantum ore related to the TVA and He Who Remains? Particularly the tempad and manipulation of time? Of course, I don't think most people need a super detailed explanation of how this works, and I'm sure for many the confusion of the timeline shenanigans is already throwing them off, as this show can be pretty confusing. I think that most would be satisfied with a general conceptual explanation of how it all works, such as the temporal loom being able to just weave the alternate timelines into the sacred timeline, though I wonder if it would even really have that capability considering the alleged purpose of the TVA, to keep Kangs from rising up. Obviously, the major threat then is still that all of these alternate timelines are being preserved and they are producing Kang variants. It would be crazy though if somehow we were to discover that the loom actually prunes Kang variants from their timelines or something to that effect. While that is a bit far-fetched at the moment, I almost wonder if the loom could be retrofitted to do something similar to that. Perhaps an eventual solution to the Kang problem is actually through the TVA itself. Perhaps if the loom is capable of holding infinite timelines, then it could prune the Kang variants from each timeline that's pulled in through it. While this is also pretty far-fetched, I thought I'd throw it out there because I'm honestly not sure how you do go about defeating and preventing Kangs from rising up without doing something similar to what He Who Remains was doing with the Sacred Timeline and the TVA. So I can totally see where Loki is coming from. Realistically, how do you go about preventing all these Kang variants from popping up? It gets even more wild when considering that Universe 838 may not even be connected to this TVA or the Sacred Timeline to begin with. I am still unsure how Timeline 838 connects to all of this, and we're also still in the dark on where the TVA actually is or how time does or doesn't operate there, as this could tie into why so many things just don't make sense yet. I think that the loom is pulling in all of the strands that would form what we know of as the 616 Sacred Timeline, and that this is evidenced by screens and monitors within the show that clearly state that the Sacred Timeline is Universe 616, and when looking at the names given to variant branches, they are all variations of the 616 timeline, such as 616.43, and these numbers change more the further the timeline is allowed to branch. I believe this implies that all universes are intrinsically linked to one another, and that they all branch off to and from one another in their own sorts of Ouroboros cycles, as it appears that in order for the multiverse to truly open up, the sacred timeline just needed to expand beyond the red line of the TVA monitor. The red line does then indicate that the formation of the multiverse is occurring, or at the very least that the 616 universe is no longer separate from the multiverse. However, as we see what appears similar to a Big Bang-like event at the end of Loki episode 4, it may actually mean that the multiversal war has not occurred because the temporal loom has been doing its job of weaving together the timelines into one rope-like strand that can be managed and prune off branches that will eventually form into wholly separate timelines, such as 838, that will have its own variants of Kang. I think that the loom has been weaving together timelines that include Kang or Victor Timely, but only those that were approved by He Who Remains, ones that wouldn't branch off into entirely separate timelines, variants he felt he could control or use as contingency plans. What still confuses me about the loom is the idea that it's creating order from entropy, from temporal decay that apparently just floats around in space or within the black hole the 616 universe is in. Though, that's the part I think that helps explain it, is that the loom in the TVA, albeit I don't exactly know where within one, but the TVA is certainly inside of a black hole as visually laid out by the finale of Season 1, as we zoom into a black hole to the Citadel at the end of time to start off the episode with Loki and Sylvie walking up to the Citadel. So, if we were inside of a black hole and there's a great deal of temporal radiation that builds up, I think that He Who Remains has been using the temporal loom to prevent the universe from engaging in its natural reset. And perhaps Loki is an agent of chaos that helped restart this cycle. A positive Ragnarok, if you will. In the finale of Loki Season 1, we see a universe crunch down and then experience a Big Bang and expand outward into what we perceive as a universe within a black hole. Then we zoom into another black hole, in which the sacred timeline is housed, and yet we don't see a similar reset even after He Who Remains is killed. In fact, we only see this at the end of episode 4 of Season 2, as this was the point in which the temporal radiation had finally gotten high enough that the black hole collapses in on itself, as gravity becomes so strong that it contracts the energy and matter of the universe rather than expanding. And not only do we sort of see this happening in Loki Season 2 episode 4, but this is actually very similar to the Big Bounce theory, which states that the universe contracts and expands in an endless loop. To quote the very reputable Wikipedia, the main idea behind the quantum theory of a big bounce is that as density approaches infinity, the behavior of the quantum foam changes. All the so-called fundamental physical constants, including the speed of light in vacuum, need not remain constant during a big crunch, especially in the time interval smaller than that in which measurement may never be possible, spanning or bracketing the point of inflection. So, while it's confusing, I think that the Big Bounce fits well with what is happening in Loki Season 2, and that the loom was not only weaving together the 616 timeline, but it was doing so in order to prevent the natural laws and physics of the universe from changing, to keep another Big Bounce from occurring. As that quote mentioned, in a Big Bounce, density approaches infinity and that quantum foam changes. And again, not to delve way too deep into this, but essentially quantum foam is essentially thought to be small-scale fluctuations in space and time due to the properties of quantum mechanics. Essentially, in a Big Bounce, it sounds like the universe randomizes a bit and may even perhaps rewrite laws of the universe, such as how physics will operate within that particular universe, and these quantum fluctuations could account for all of the differences and variants that we see. So the loom was preventing any changes to the current order of the 616 timeline and its branches, so as to prevent the cycle from restarting. And I don't see any reason why He Who Remains couldn't have continued to just do that unless Loki is truly an agent of the universe to bring about chaos, and return the natural order and create a whole new universe that goes against the artificial, man-made temporal loom. The loom was holding the universe back.